I always thought my life was a steady rhythm, like the hum of the coffee maker every morning or the predictable creak of our porch swing on breezy evenings. My name's Daniel, and for 12 years, I'd built a world with Claire, my wife, my anchor. She had this way of lighting up a room, her laughter spilling out like warm honey, and I'd catch myself staring at her across the kitchen table, wondering how I'd gotten so lucky. We lived in a quiet suburb, the kind with manicured lawns and nosy neighbors who waved too enthusiastically. Our routine was simple. I worked as a structural engineer, she taught art at the community college. Nights were ours, dinners, movies, her sketching while I read. It was ordinary, sure, but it was ours. That changed last summer. I'd been working late on a bridge project, the kind of job that demanded precision and left me drained. Claire started staying out later too, claiming extra classes or gallery events. I didn't think much of it. Her passion for art was one of the things I adored. But then came the little shifts. Her phone buzzed more often, and she'd tilt the screen away from me, her fingers quick to lock it. She'd hum tunes I didn't recognize, and her wardrobe sprouted new pieces. Silky blouses, a pair of heels I'd never seen. Gifts from a student, she'd say, brushing it off with a smile. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? One night I came home early. The house was dark, her car gone. A note on the counter read, "At a friend's, back late." Something gnawed at me, a splinter of doubt I couldn't shake. I poured a whiskey, sat in the silence, and waited. Hours ticked by. When she slipped through the door at 2 a.m., her hair was mussed, her cheeks flushed. "Lost track of time," she mumbled, avoiding my eyes. I nodded, swallowing the question lodged in my throat. But the air felt different after that. Thicker, heavier, like a storm brewing just out of sight. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. I started noticing things I'd missed before. How Claire's stories didn't quite line up. How she'd drift off mid-conversation. Her mind somewhere I couldn't follow. I told myself it was nothing, that I was paranoid. But doubt is a relentless thing. It burrows in, festers. I began watching her more closely, not out of suspicion but a need to understand. She'd leave the room to take calls, her voice dropping to a whisper. She'd come home smelling faintly of cologne. Not mine. And once, I found a receipt in her purse for a restaurant we'd never been to together. "A colleague took me," she said when I asked, her tone too casual. Then came the day I met him. His name was Marcus, a guest lecturer at her college. I'd gone to surprise Claire with lunch, a rare break from my deadline crunch. I found her in the courtyard, laughing with him, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that seemed too comfortable. She introduced us, her hand lingering on his arm a beat too long. "Marcus is brilliant with sculpture," she gushed. He shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes appraising me like I was a puzzle he'd already solved. I smiled, played the good husband, but something coiled tight in my chest. That night she was different, distant, distracted. I asked about Marcus, keeping my voice light. "Oh, he's just a friend," she said, brushing her hair back. A nervous tick I hadn't seen in years. I didn't push, but the coil tightened. Over the next few days his name popped up more, Marcus this, Marcus that. She'd light up talking about him, her words spilling out in a rush. I'd nod, pretending it didn't sting. But it did. It was like watching her slip away, piece by piece, and I couldn't figure out how to hold on. I needed proof. Not because I wanted to believe it, but because I couldn't live with the not knowing. So I started digging. Felt wrong, invasive, like I was betraying her by doubting her. But the alternative, blind trust, was crumbling. I checked her phone one night while she showered, the steam seeping under the bathroom door. Her passcode was still our anniversary, 12/12. Messages from Marcus glowed on the screen. "Missed you today. Can't wait for Thursday." A string of hearts. My stomach churned. Thursday. She told me she had a late class that day. I didn't confront her. Instead, I waited. Thursday came, and she left the house in those new heels, a scarf I didn't recognize draped over her shoulders. "Be home late," she called, her voice bright. I followed her. It was reckless, stupid even, but I had to see. Her car wound through the city, past the college to a sleek apartment building downtown. I parked a block away, watched her step out, glance around, then disappear inside. Minutes later, Marcus appeared at a window, pulling her close. They laughed, her head tipping back the way it used to with me. Then the curtains closed. I sat there for hours, the engine off, the silence deafening. My mind raced. Every moment we'd shared, every promise, now tainted. When she came home that night, she smelled of wine and him. "How was class?" I asked, my voice steady. "Fine," she said, yawning. "Tiring." I nodded, poured myself another drink, and let the lie hang between us. That's when I knew. Trust was gone, and something darker was taking its place. The betrayal wasn't just the act, it was the creativity of it, the audacity. Claire had always been inventive, her artist's mind weaving beauty from chaos. Now I saw that talent turned against me. She'd built a secret life, intricate and bold, right under my nose. I found more evidence. A sketchbook tucked in her bag, filled with drawings of Marcus. Not just portraits, but moments. His hands shaping clay, his profile against a sunset, her initials tangled with his in the margins. It was intimate, personal, a gallery of her obsession. I started piecing it together. She'd been meeting him for months, not just Thursdays. Gallery openings, work trips, late-night inspiration sessions. All excuses I'd swallowed whole. The worst part? She'd brought him into our world. I remembered a dinner party we'd hosted, Marcus among the guests. She'd glowed that night, her laughter sharper, her glances darting to him. I thought it was the wine. Now I saw it for what it was. Her flaunting him, testing me, and I'd been too blind to notice. I couldn't sleep anymore. I'd lie beside her, her breathing soft, and imagine him in her dreams. My hands itched to shake her awake, demand answers, but I held back. Rage was building, yes, but so was something colder, calculation. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to lose what I'd lost. I started planning, not sure what yet, just knowing it had to be cruel, deliberate, a mirror to her betrayal. The next twist came by accident. I was at the hardware store buying supplies for a deck repair when I saw them, Claire and Marcus, across the parking lot, loading a sculpture into his truck. She wore gloves, his gloves, too big for her hands, and they moved together like a dance, effortless, familiar. Then it happened. She stumbled, he caught her, and instead of pulling away, she leaned in. He lifted her onto the tailgate, her legs dangling, and they shared a moment, quiet, tender, her hand brushing his cheek. It wasn't loud or overt, but it was worse. It was love. I drove home shaking, the nails and wood forgotten in my trunk. Love. Not just a fling, not a mistake, but something deeper. She'd given him what she'd promised me. Her heart, her future. That night, she came home humming, oblivious. "Good day," I asked, stirring pasta. "The best," she said, smiling. I smiled back, but inside the plan solidified. Revenge wouldn't be quick. It'd be slow, meticulous, a masterpiece of pain. She'd built her secret world. Now I'd dismantle it, piece by agonizing piece. The days after that parking lot scene were a blur of quiet fury. I couldn't look at Claire without seeing her perched on Marcus's tailgate, her fingers grazing his face. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though that burned, but the ease, the intimacy. She'd carved out a space with him that I'd never touched, a secret garden blooming behind my back. I kept up the charade at home, cooking dinners, asking about her day, even laughing at her jokes. She didn't notice the edge in my voice, the way my eyes lingered too long, searching for cracks in her mask. I needed more than suspicion, I needed leverage. So I dug deeper. Her laptop sat on the dining table one morning, left open while she showered. I hesitated, then slid into the chair. Her email was a goldmine. Messages to Marcus stretched back months, casual at first, talk of art, schedules, then warmer, flirtatious until they were planning rendezvous. One stood out. "Our little project is almost ready. Can't wait to show you." Project. Not her college work, not anything she'd mentioned to me. I scrolled further, Found photos attached. Her and Marcus in a studio, clay-smeared and grinning, a half-finished sculpture between them. It was abstract, twisted, but I recognized her style. She'd poured herself into it, into him. That night, she hummed while sketching, oblivious to my silence. I asked, casual as ever, "Working on anything new?" She glanced up, eyes flickering. "Just some ideas," she said, tucking the sketchbook away. I nodded, poured her wine, and let the lie settle. The project gnawed at me. Not just a betrayal of us, but of her art, the thing I'd always supported. It was theirs now, a monument to her infidelity. That's when the shape of my revenge began to form. I wouldn't just break her heart. I'd break what she'd built with him, turn her passion into ash. I started shadowing them. Not every day, just enough to map their world. Marcus's apartment became a focal point, a sleek loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that mocked my suburban life. I'd park nearby, watch them come and go, their rhythm so practiced it hurt. Once, I saw her carry a canvas inside, her step light, eager. Another time, they emerged with takeout bags, her arm looped through his. It was mundane, domestic, and that made it worse. Proof she'd nested there, built a second home. I needed an edge, so I turned to their digital trails. Claire wasn't careful, her social media was private, but Marcus's wasn't. His posts were sparse, artsy shots of sculptures, but the comments told a story. Friends tagged him at galleries, praised his muse. One photo stopped me cold. Claire's hand, unmistakable with her silver ring, resting on a clay figure. Caption, "Inspiration strikes again." Posted 3 months ago, when she told me she was visiting her sister. The lie stung fresh. At home, I tested her. "Ever think of collaborating with someone?" I asked over breakfast. She froze, fork midair, then smiled. "Maybe someday," she said, too smooth. I pressed further, mentioning Marcus offhand, how talented he seemed. Her cheeks pinked, her words stumbling. "He's good, yeah." I let it drop, but the flush confirmed it. She was in deep. That night, I lay awake, plotting. Destroying their affair wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel exposed, humiliated, to watch her precious project crumble before her eyes. The how was still hazy, but the why was crystal clear. The sculpture became my obsession. It was their secret, their bond, and I needed to know it fully. I remembered Claire mentioning a gallery event, some showcase for local artists. She'd been vague, but Marcus's posts pinned it. A downtown venue, next Friday. She'd never invited me, of course, but I went anyway. I dressed down, blended into the crowd, and slipped in unnoticed. The place buzzed with pretentious chatter, wine glasses clinking. Then I saw it, their project. A towering piece, all curves and hollows, clay fired to a glossy sheen. The plaque read, "Erosion of Time" by Marcus Vail and Claire Ellis. She was there, radiant in a black dress, laughing with him by the piece. They moved like partners, fielding praise, their hands brushing as they gestured. I stood back, unnoticed, my pulse hammering. It wasn't just art. It was them, their story molded into every line. A critic gushed about raw connection, and Claire beamed, oblivious to me in the shadows. I left before she could spot me, the image seared into my mind. That night, she came home late, buzzing about the event. "It went well," I asked, voice neutral. "Better than I hoped," she said, glowing. I smiled, said nothing, and poured another drink. The sculpture was my in. It was public, tangible, her pride and his triumph. I turned it into her shame. I started researching gallery contacts, event photos, anything I could use. Revenge wasn't just personal anymore. It was structural, a demolition job. I'd bring it all down, piece by piece, and she'd never see it coming. I needed allies, or at least tools. I couldn't do this alone, not cleanly. So I reached out to an old friend, Tom, a guy from college who'd gone into private investigation. We met at a dive bar, the kind with sticky tables and dim lights. I laid it out, Claire, Marcus, the sculpture, the lies. Tom didn't judge, just sipped his beer and nodded. "You want dirt or destruction?" he asked. Both, I said. He grinned, promised to dig into Marcus's life, finances, habits, skeletons. Give me a week, he said. Meanwhile, I kept up the act at home. Claire was riding high from the gallery, chattering about commissions, oblivious to my distance. I'd nod, cook, play the doting husband, but my mind was elsewhere. Tom called 5 days later. Your guy's got debts, he said. Gallery loans, a car he can't afford, and a temper. Bar fight last year, hushed up. It wasn't much, but it was a crack. I thanked him, told him to keep looking. That night, Claire sketched Marcus again. I glimpsed it before she hid the page. My hands shook, but I stayed calm. Patience was my weapon now. I visited the gallery alone, posing as a buyer. The manager was chatty, proud of erosion of time. A labor of love, she said. They worked on it for months. I asked about its value, high but fragile, she admitted. One wrong move and it'd shatter. I filed that away, a seed planted. Revenge was taking shape. Expose Marcus's flaws, ruin their creation, leave Claire with nothing but regret. The plan crystallized over coffee one morning, alone in our kitchen. Claire was out. Another meeting. And I sat with Tom's notes spread before me. Marcus's debts were leverage. The sculpture was the target. I'd hit both hard. First, I'd destabilize him financially, anonymous tips to his creditors, nudging them to call in loans. Then, the gallery piece. It wasn't enough to destroy it physically. It had to be public, humiliating, a spectacle she couldn't escape. I'd turn her triumph into a nightmare. I tested her again that night. Heard Marcus might be in over his head. I said, casual, stirring soup. She frowned, confused. What do you mean? Just rumors, money stuff. Her eyes darted away, then back, a forced laugh. He's fine, she said, too quick. I let it go, but the seed was planted in her too. Doubt. Good. She'd feel it soon enough, magnified 1,000 times. I smiled into my bowl, the broth warm, my resolve colder than ever. The endgame was near, and she'd never suspect the architect behind it. The next phase was delicate, like laying the groundwork for a bridge. Every piece had to fit. Tom came through with more on Marcus. A lien on his loft, a missed payment on that truck I'd seen them load. Small cracks, but I'd widen them. I made calls, posing as a concerned associate, nudging his creditors to tighten the screws. Within days, Tom reported Marcus scrambling. Phone arguments, late-night pacing at his place. Good. Pressure was the first blow. At home, Claire grew jittery. She'd check her phone more, frown at messages, then force a smile when I looked up. Everything okay? I'd ask, all concern. Just work stress, she'd say, her voice thin. I'd nod, pour her tea, let her stew. She didn't know I'd seen the texts. Marcus venting about money crap, her promising to help him, with what, our savings. The thought fueled me. I checked our accounts, nothing missing yet, but I locked them down just in case. The sculpture loomed larger in my mind. Erosion of time. Poetic, fragile, their pride. I revisited the gallery, chatted up the manager again. Ever had vandalism? I asked casual. She sighed, mentioned a near miss last year. Paint thrown, easily cleaned. But this piece, she said, nodding at it. One good hit and it's dust. I smiled, thanked her, and left. Destruction wasn't enough. It had to be public, personal. I started sketching my own plan, not on paper but in my head. A collapse, a crowd, Claire's face as it all fell apart. Marcus cracked faster than I'd hoped. Tom called, gleeful. Repo guy took his truck yesterday. He's spiraling, yelling at Claire on the phone. I pictured her, torn between her lover's mess and her perfect lie. She came home that night, eyes red, claiming allergies. I played along, offered soup, watched her pick at it. Rough day, I asked. You could say that, she muttered, avoiding me. I didn't push, let her simmer. The next day, she left early, muttering about a friend in trouble. I knew where she was going. I followed, parked a block from Marcus's loft. She stormed out an hour later, him trailing, gesturing wildly. Their voices carried, her sharp, his desperate. "I can't fix this alone," he snapped. She shook her head, climbed into her car, sped off. I stayed, watched him slump against the building. Vulnerable. Perfect. That night, I sent an email from a burner account to the gallery. A tip about Marcus's instability, suggesting he might lash out. Plausible given his temper. Seeds of doubt, sprouting everywhere. Claire was quieter now, her glow dimming. She sketched less, stared out windows more. I kept the pressure subtle, offhand comments about loyalty, trust. "People show who they are under stress," I said once, stirring coffee. She flinched, said nothing. I smiled into my mug. The final act was near. I'd dismantle their world at the gallery's next event. A celebration of local art. Their sculpture would headline, and I'd make sure it was unforgettable. The event was set for Saturday, a week away. I RSVP'd as a +1 through a coworker, keeping my name off the list. Claire mentioned it casually. Another gallery thing. Not inviting me, of course. I nodded, feigned disinterest, but inside, I was wiring the plan tight. Tom dug up one last gem. Marcus had a side hustle, selling knockoff art online, barely legal. I fed that to the gallery too, hinting at reputation risks. They wouldn't act yet, but it'd amplify the fallout. I visited a supply store, bought what I needed. A small remote device, discreet, precise. Nothing loud or messy, just enough to destabilize clay under stress. The sculpture's hollows were its weakness. I'd seen it up close. I tested the setup in our garage, late at night, Claire asleep upstairs. A faint hum, a vibration, a crack in a test piece. It worked. She'd never trace it to me. Too technical, too unlike her Daniel. That was the beauty of it. She'd underestimated me from the start. Friday night, she packed a dress, humming nervously. "Big day tomorrow," she said, half to herself. "Hope it goes well," I replied, folding laundry. She smiled, distracted, kissed my cheek. I held her gaze a second too long, saw her falter, then turn away. She didn't know it was her last night of ignorance. I barely slept, running the steps in my mind. Arrive early, plant the device, blend in, watch it unfold. Cruel? Yes. Deserved? Absolutely. Saturday dawned gray, fittingly ominous. Claire left at noon, buoyant despite her stress. I waited an hour, then drove downtown, parked blocks away. The gallery buzzed with early arrivals. Critics, artists, locals in stiff collars. I slipped in, a nobody in a borrowed suit, carrying a satchel. The sculpture stood center stage, spotlit, majestic. I lingered nearby, pretending to admire it, then crouched as if tying my shoe. The device slid into a crevice at its base. Tiny, invisible, timed for the peak of the evening. I stood, mingled, sipped cheap wine, my pulse steady. Claire arrived with Marcus, both polished but tense. She wore that black dress, he a tight smile. They posed by their piece, fielding praise, though his eyes darted creditors, maybe, or guilt. The crowd thickened, speeches droned. I stayed back, counting minutes. At 8 p.m., the gallery head took the mic, lauding erosion of time. Claire beamed, Marcus nodded, and I pressed the remote in my pocket. A low hum, then a crack, sharp, echoing. The sculpture shuddered, fissures racing up its curves. Gasps rippled through the room as it collapsed, clay shattering across the floor. Claire froze, her face draining of color. Marcus lunged forward, uselessly, as the crowd murmured shock, then whispers of flawed work. Amateur. I watched her crumble, not the sculpture, but her. Critics turned away, Marcus cursed, and she stood there, hands trembling, their triumph dust at her feet. I slipped out, unnoticed, the chaos my signature. I was home when she returned, past midnight. She didn't speak, just dropped her bag, sank onto the couch, staring at nothing. "Bad night?" I asked, setting a glass of water beside her. She nodded, voice gone. "It fell apart," she whispered, tears brimming. I sat across from her, calm, attentive. The sculpture. Everything, she said, breaking. I let her cry, let the weight settle. She didn't know I'd orchestrated it. Didn't suspect the calls, the device, the months of watching her unravel. Marcus faded fast. Creditors closed in, the gallery blacklisted him, his knockoff scheme leaked online. Claire stopped sketching, stopped humming. She'd murmur about mistakes. Never confessing, but I saw it. Guilt, loss, the life she'd built with him gone. I stayed the husband. Supportive, steady, while she shrank into herself. The revenge wasn't loud or bloody. It was surgical, stripping her of what she'd stolen from me. Trust, pride, passion. Our home grew silent, a mausoleum of our past. I'd won, not by breaking her body, but her spirit. And she'd never know it was me. Just feel it, every hollow day, until the end.